Picture this. It's August 27th, 1776, and you're standing in a muddy Brooklyn field, watching 23,000 British and Hessian soldiers march toward you with parade ground precision. You're a farmer from Massachusetts who joined the Continental Army 3 months ago because you believed in liberty. You have a rusty musket, 40 rounds of ammunition, and you're positioned behind a hastily dug earthwork that wouldn't stop a determined dog. Your commander is a 32-year-old tobacco planter from Virginia who has never led an army in battle. The enemy coming at you represents the most powerful military machine on Earth. They have crushed rebellions on 3 continents. They have professional soldiers who have trained since childhood. They have artillery that can blow your position to splinters. And they have a plan to end this revolution before summer turns to fall. You look to your left and see boys younger than your son. You look to your right and see grandfathers older than your father. None of you are supposed to win this fight. You're supposed to die here, and with you, the dream of American independence. But here's what the British don't know. They're about to win the biggest battle of the entire war, and still lose everything that matters. They're going to shatter Washington's army, capture New York, and drive the rebels into full retreat. But in trying to kill the revolution quickly, they're going to make a series of mistakes that will keep it alive just long enough to become unstoppable. This is the story of the Battle of Long Island, the moment when everything collapsed and somehow the Continental Army survived to fight another day. Before diving into this forgotten moment, when America nearly died at birth, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that subscribe button for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand why you should be absolutely terrified standing in that Brooklyn field, you need to understand what's coming at you. The British Empire in 1776 isn't just powerful. It's a global superpower that makes modern military forces look hesitant by comparison. They don't negotiate with rebels. They crush them. They've been doing it for centuries. The army marching toward Long Island isn't a ragtag collection of militia. It's the finest fighting force in the Western world. At its core are British regulars, men who joined the army as teenagers and have been drilling every single day since. They march in perfect formation. They fire in controlled volleys. They fought in Europe, the Caribbean, and India. They're professionals in an era when that word actually means something. Their red coats aren't just for show. They're psychological warfare. When you see that wall of red advancing with bayonets fixed, when you hear the drums beating and the officers shouting commands, every instinct in your body screams run. And most militia do exactly that. The British know it, and they count on it. Supporting these regulars are 8,000 Hessian mercenaries from German states. These aren't conscripts. They're soldiers whose princes rent them out to the highest bidder. The Hessians have a reputation for brutality that's mostly earned. They're disciplined, they're experienced, and they follow orders without question. To the American farmers facing them, the Hessians look like something out of a nightmare. Tall grenadiers with brass-fronted caps that make them look even taller. Jaegers, elite riflemen, who can hit a man at 300 yards. They don't speak English, which somehow makes them more terrifying. Leading this massive force is General William Howe, and Howe is nobody's fool. He's a veteran of the French and Indian War. He actually likes Americans, or at least he did before they started shooting at his men. Howe understands that this rebellion needs to be crushed quickly before it metastasizes into something the Empire can't control. His brother, Admiral Richard Howe, commands the Royal Navy ships that brought this army across the Atlantic. Together, the Howe brothers have been given one mission: end this nonsense and restore order to the colonies. The plan is elegant in its simplicity. Capture New York City. Cut New England off from the other colonies. Strangle the rebellion by controlling the Hudson River. Once New York falls, the revolution dies. It's simple mathematics. The British had been preparing this operation for months. After the humiliation at Boston, where Washington had fortified Dorchester Heights and forced them to evacuate, the Empire wanted revenge. They wanted to make an example that would terrify every colonial farmer thinking about picking up a musket. The force they assembled was the largest expeditionary army Britain had ever sent overseas. Think about that. Bigger than anything they'd sent to fight the French. Bigger than anything they'd deployed in Europe. 23,000 trained soldiers supported by dozens of warships and hundreds of transport vessels. The logistics alone were staggering. And all of it aimed at one objective: destroy George Washington's Continental Army. But here's what makes this moment so terrifying for the Americans. They know the British are coming. They've known for weeks. Washington has been watching British ships arrive in New York Harbor since late June, each one disgorging more red-coated soldiers onto Staten Island. He's been counting them like a man watching storm clouds gather, and he knows he can't match them. Not in numbers, not in training, not in equipment. What Washington has is 19,000 men on paper. In reality, maybe 14,000 fit for duty. Many are sick with dysentery or smallpox. Most have never been in a real battle. Their weapons are a mix of hunting rifles, old muskets, and whatever they grabbed when they left their farms. Some don't have bayonets, which means they can't fight hand-to-hand against British regulars. It's a recipe for disaster. But Washington has a problem that goes beyond numbers. He has to defend an impossible position. New York City in 1776 sits at the southern tip of Manhattan Island. Brooklyn sits across the East River on Long Island. To defend New York, Washington needs to hold both. But both are islands, which means the Royal Navy can sail around them, land troops wherever they want, and cut off his escape routes. It's a defender's nightmare. Every military advisor Washington consults tells him the same thing: abandon New York, retreat to defensible ground, and preserve the army. But Washington can't do that. Not politically. Congress wants New York defended. The civilian population expects protection. And Washington himself believes that giving up the city without a fight would destroy morale and make the revolution look weak. So he makes a fateful decision. He splits his army. Half stays in Manhattan. Half crosses to Brooklyn to defend the high ground called Brooklyn Heights. It's exactly what you're not supposed to do when facing a superior force. Never divide your army in the face of the enemy. It's a basic principle of warfare that goes back to ancient times. But Washington is trapped between military logic and political necessity. He chooses politics. He's gambling that he can hold both positions long enough for the British to make a mistake, or for reinforcements to arrive, or for something, anything, to shift the odds. It's a desperate gamble, and General Howe is about to call his bluff. The morning of August 22nd, 1776, brings clear skies and calm winds. Perfect weather for an amphibious assault. At dawn, the Royal Navy begins ferrying British and Hessian troops from Staten Island to the beaches of Long Island. It's a massive operation. Flatboats packed with soldiers row across the Narrows under the protection of warship guns. The Americans watch from their positions and can't do anything to stop it. They don't have a navy. They don't have coastal artillery in position. They can only watch as boat after boat lands, and the red tide keeps growing. By the end of the day, 15,000 British and Hessian soldiers are ashore on Long Island. They establish a beachhead near the village of Gravesend and begin unpacking their artillery. The invasion has begun, and it's going exactly according to Howe's plan. Washington, watching from Brooklyn Heights, realizes his worst fears are coming true. The British aren't attacking Manhattan. They're going after Brooklyn first. If they take the Heights, their artillery will command the East River, and Manhattan will be indefensible. The entire American position will collapse. He rushes more troops across the river to reinforce Brooklyn, but he's playing catch-up and he knows it. The geography of Brooklyn becomes crucial to understanding what happens next. Brooklyn Heights is a ridge running north to south along the East River. It's high ground, which means whoever controls it controls everything around it. But between the beaches, where the British landed, and Brooklyn Heights, lies a densely wooded area called the Heights of Guan. This is a series of forested hills cut by 4 roads, 4 passes that the British have to march through to reach the American positions. From north to south, these passes are the Gowanus Road along the coast, the Flatbush Road in the center, the Bedford Road slightly east, and the Jamaica Road farthest to the east. Washington's plan is simple. Hold these passes. Make the British fight through the woods, where their superior numbers and discipline don't matter as much. Turn every pass into a killing ground. If the Redcoats want Brooklyn Heights, make them pay for every yard. It's a sound defensive strategy, and it might have worked if Washington had actually concentrated his forces. and if his intelligence network had been functioning, and if his subordinate commanders had been competent. But none of those ifs came true. The American forces defending the passes are a patchwork of regiments from different colonies, most of whom have never worked together. The commanders include some competent officers and some political appointees who have no business leading men in combat. There's no unified command structure. There's no clear chain of communication. It's an organizational disaster waiting to happen. Washington places General John Sullivan in overall command of the forward positions. Sullivan is brave, and he's loyal, but he's not a tactical genius. Under him are brigade commanders like Lord Stirling, a New Jersey nobleman who insists on using his Scottish title even though the House of Lords never recognized it, and General Samuel Parsons, a Connecticut lawyer turned soldier. These are men doing their best in an impossible situation. The critical mistake, the one that will doom the entire defense, happens at the easternmost pass. The Jamaica Road is the longest route, winding through the woods for miles before it loops around behind the American positions. Because it's so far east and so circuitous, the Americans assume the British won't use it. They post a tiny patrol of 5 officers and a handful of militiamen to watch it. That's it. 5 officers to guard the back door to the entire American position. It's a catastrophic oversight, and a British patrol is about to find it. General Howe is playing a much more sophisticated game than Washington realizes. The British commander has no intention of launching frontal assaults against fortified positions. He saw what happened at Bunker Hill, where the British won but lost over 1,000 men doing it. Howe learned from that bloodbath. He's not going to waste his professional soldiers on suicidal charges. Instead, he's going to use the oldest trick in the military handbook, the flanking maneuver. While the Americans are focused on defending the 3 western passes, Howe is going to march his main force around to the east, through that lightly defended Jamaica Road, and hit them from behind. It's brilliant, it's ruthless, and it requires perfect execution. On the night of August 26th, under cover of darkness, Howe puts his plan in motion. He leaves Hessian forces at the western passes with orders to demonstrate, to make noise and fire their weapons and keep the Americans focused on the front. Meanwhile, 10,000 British regulars, the cream of his army, begin a silent night march toward the Jamaica Road. Leading the column are light infantry and dragoons whose job is to capture or kill any American sentries before they can raise the alarm. Behind them march regiment after regiment of redcoats, moving through the darkness with the discipline of professional soldiers. They march in near total silence. Officers pass whispered orders. The men know that if they're discovered, the entire operation fails. At 2 in the morning, on August 27th, the British vanguard reaches the Jamaica Road. They find the American patrol exactly where Howe's intelligence said it would be. The 5 American officers are captured without a shot being fired. They never see the enemy coming. The British have just opened the back door, and there's nobody left to sound the alarm. For the next 3 hours, 10,000 British soldiers march through the Jamaica Road like ghosts. They're moving behind the entire American defensive line, getting into position to attack from the rear at dawn, and the Americans defending the passes have absolutely no idea it's happening. This is the fog of war at its most lethal. Washington is in Manhattan, trying to coordinate between 2 positions separated by a river. Sullivan is at Brooklyn Heights, blind to what's happening in the woods. The brigade commanders at the passes are focused on the Hessian forces in front of them. Nobody's watching the flank, nobody's sending out patrols to check the Jamaica Road. The Continental Army is about to be caught in the oldest trap in warfare, and they're walking into it with their eyes closed. Dawn breaks on August 27th, with a thick morning mist hanging over Long Island. The American soldiers at the passes are tired. They've been on alert all night, expecting an attack that never came. Some are eating breakfast, some are catching a few minutes of sleep, and then the Hessians attack. At the Flatbush Pass, Hessian artillery opens up with a thunderous barrage. Cannonballs tear through the trees. The Americans scramble to their positions and return fire. It's exactly what they expected. A frontal assault. They're holding their ground, trading volleys with the enemy, and for a brief moment, they think they can win this fight. At the Gowanus Pass, Lord Stirling's brigade is engaged with British forces trying to push through along the coast road. Stirling's men are fighting well, using the terrain to their advantage, making the British pay for every advance. Again, it feels like a conventional battle. defensive positions holding against a frontal attack. This is what the Americans trained for. But these attacks aren't meant to break through. They're meant to fix the Americans in place, to keep them focused forward while death approaches from behind. At 9 in the morning, the silence behind the American lines is shattered by the sound of 2 cannon shots. It's a signal. The British flanking column has reached its attack position. And now they're announcing their presence in the most terrifying way possible. The Americans at the Bedford Pass hear those cannon shots from behind them and their blood runs cold. They turn around and see something that shouldn't be possible. Redcoats. Thousands of redcoats, formed in perfect lines, emerging from the woods behind them. The back door didn't just open. It exploded off its hinges. General Sullivan realizes instantly what's happened. He's been flanked. His entire defensive line is compromised. He tries to organize a retreat, to fall back to Brooklyn Heights before the British close the trap, but it's too late. The British regulars advance with mechanical precision, their drums beating, their officers shouting commands. They're not running. They're not rushing. They're just walking forward because they know the Americans can't escape. The Bedford and Flatbush positions collapse almost immediately. American soldiers, seeing the enemy behind them and in front of them, break and run. Some try to fight their way out. Most just run for their lives through the woods, throwing away their weapons, abandoning their equipment, desperate to reach the safety of Brooklyn Heights. The retreat turns into a rout. Men stumble through the forest, lost in the thick undergrowth, hunted by British light infantry who know these woods as well as the Americans do now. General Sullivan, trying to rally his men, is cut off by British dragoons. He fights until his ammunition runs out, then surrenders. The commanding general of the forward American positions is now a prisoner of war. What's left of his command is scattered through the woods, running for their lives. But the worst is yet to come. At the Gowanus Pass, Lord Stirling's brigade is still fighting, completely unaware that the rest of the American line has collapsed. Stirling is a fighter. He's holding his position against British regulars under General James Grant, trading volleys, holding the coast road. His men are exhausted, but they're holding. And then a messenger reaches him with the news that changes everything. The army has been flanked, Sullivan is captured, the center has collapsed, and there are British forces between Stirling's position and Brooklyn Heights. Stirling is cut off. His entire brigade, roughly 1,600 men, is trapped. He has 3 choices. Surrender immediately, try to break through the British lines, or die where he stands fighting. Stirling chooses to fight. He looks at his brigade and makes a decision that will save the Continental Army even as it dooms most of his men. He needs to buy time for the broken American regiments to reach Brooklyn Heights. If the British close the trap completely, Washington's entire army will be captured. The revolution will end today. So Stirling does the only thing he can do. He attacks. What happens next is one of the most desperate and heroic last stands of the entire Revolutionary War. Stirling picks 400 men from the Maryland regiments. He looks at these farmers and shopkeepers wearing whatever passed for a uniform, and he tells them what he needs. They have to attack a fortified British position. They have to hit veteran regulars, who outnumber them 3-1. They have to do it knowing most of them won't survive. And they have to do it now. The Maryland men don't hesitate. They fix their bayonets, what bayonets they have, and they charge. 400 Americans attacking across open ground toward a stone house called the Old Stone House, where British forces are dug in with artillery support. It's suicide. It's also necessary. The first Maryland charge hits the British line like a wave hitting a seawall. The Redcoats, shocked that these rebels are attacking instead of running, fire a devastating volley. Marylanders fall by the dozens. The charge breaks. Stirling reforms his men and attacks again. A second charge. More Americans fall. The British hold their position. Stirling attacks a third time, then a fourth, then a fifth. 6 times, the Maryland line charges that stone house. 6 times, they're thrown back. Men are shot down advancing. Men are bayoneted in hand-to-hand fighting. The ground in front of the Old Stone House becomes carpeted with American dead and wounded. But every charge buys 5 more minutes. Every minute means more broken American regiments reaching Brooklyn Heights. Stirling's sacrifice is buying time with blood. Finally, After the sixth charge, there aren't enough Marylanders left standing to attack again. Sterling looks at what's left of his brigade, maybe 100 men still on their feet, and realizes he's done all he can. The British are closing in from three sides. There's no escape. Sterling himself charges one more time, trying to cut his way through to captivity with honor. He reaches British lines and surrenders his sword to a Hessian general. The Maryland line, what's left of it, is captured or killed. Out of 400 men who made those charges, only a handful escape. The rest are dead or prisoners. George Washington watches this sacrifice from across Gowanus Creek. He has a telescope trained on the old stone house. He sees the Maryland boys charge again and again into certain death. According to witnesses, Washington repeats one phrase over and over as he watches his men die. Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose. He understands what Sterling is doing. He understands the price being paid, and he can't do anything to stop it or help. All he can do is watch and remember. By early afternoon on August 27th, the Battle of Long Island is effectively over. The Americans have been shattered. They've lost over 300 killed, over 700 captured, including 2 generals, another 700 wounded. The British have achieved exactly what they wanted. They've crushed Washington's army in open battle and proven that the Continental Army can't stand against British regulars in a conventional fight. General Howe surveys the battlefield with satisfaction. The rebels are trapped on Brooklyn Heights with their backs to the East River. He has them surrounded on 3 sides. The Royal Navy controls the river. It's a perfect siege situation. All he has to do is bring up his artillery, bombard the heights into submission, and accept Washington's surrender. The revolution will be over by the end of the week, but Howe makes a decision that will haunt British commanders for the rest of the war. Instead of pressing the attack immediately, instead of storming the heights while the Americans are still disorganized and demoralized, he decides to do this properly. He orders his men to begin digging siege trenches. He's going to approach the heights using formal siege tactics, advancing his artillery behind earthworks, minimizing British casualties. It's the professional, by-the-book approach. It's also slow, and it gives Washington something he desperately needs: time. On Brooklyn Heights, the situation is desperate beyond words. Washington has ferried reinforcements across from Manhattan, bringing his total force on the heights to about 9,000 men. But they're trapped. The British and Hessians are digging in to the south and east. The East River is to their backs, and a storm is rolling in. Rain begins to fall on the evening of August 27th. It's cold, miserable, and unrelenting. The Americans have no shelter. They're standing in muddy trenches, soaked to the skin, watching British working parties inch closer with every hour. Many of the men are so exhausted they fall asleep standing up. Officers walk the lines to keep them from collapsing. Morale is non-existent. These men just watched their army get destroyed. They saw their friends killed or captured. They know they're surrounded. And they're waiting for the final British assault that will end everything. Washington calls a council of war with his remaining officers. The question is simple. Do they stay and fight? Or do they try something desperate? Every officer in that tent knows the odds. If they stay, they'll be forced to surrender within days. Ammunition is running low. Food is scarce. The men are exhausted. A siege will starve them out even if the British don't storm the position. But retreating seems impossible. To evacuate 9,000 men across the East River requires boats they don't have, time they don't have, and weather conditions that won't cooperate. The Royal Navy patrols the river. If they're caught halfway across, it'll be a slaughter. And yet, staying means losing the entire army. It means losing the revolution. Washington makes the hardest decision of his military career. They're going to retreat. They're going to evacuate every man, every weapon, every piece of equipment they can carry. And they're going to do it under the nose of the British Army without being detected. It's insane. It requires perfect coordination, perfect discipline, and perfect luck, none of which the Continental Army has demonstrated so far. But it's the only option that doesn't end with surrender. Washington sends out a call for every boat on the east side of Manhattan. Fishing boats, ferry boats, rowboats, anything that floats. He tells his men they're being reinforced, not retreated. Because if the troops know they're running, panic will set in. He positions his most reliable regiments, the Massachusetts men who held at Bunker Hill, at the waterfront, to organize the evacuation, and he orders absolute silence, no talking, no fires, no noise that might alert British sentries less than a quarter-mile away. As darkness falls on August 29th, the evacuation begins. It's raining heavily now, which is both a curse and a blessing. The rain makes the men more miserable, but it also covers noise and reduces visibility. British sentries hunker down in their own trenches, trying to stay dry, not particularly vigilant. Regiment by regiment, the Americans begin moving down to the ferry landing. They march in silence through ankle-deep mud. Officers whisper orders. Men wrap their musket locks in cloth to keep them dry and quiet. The boats begin shuttling back and forth across the East River in the darkness. The operation requires a level of discipline the Continental Army supposedly doesn't possess, but somehow, impossibly, it works. The men who weeks ago were running from British cavalry are now conducting a nighttime, amphibious withdrawal in perfect silence. Fear is a powerful motivator. They know if they're discovered, they're dead. So they move like ghosts. Each boatload of soldiers means a few hundred fewer men on the heights. But the evacuation is agonizingly slow. The boats can only hold so many. The weather slows everything down. And dawn is coming. If the sun rises and the British see what's happening, the Royal Navy will be on them in minutes. Washington himself stays on the heights all night, moving between positions, making sure every regiment knows when it's their turn to move. He can't show fear. He can't show doubt. His men need to believe this is going to work. Around 4 a.m, something miraculous happens. The wind shifts. For the entire night, it's been blowing from the northeast, making it difficult for the sailboats to cross. Suddenly, it shifts to the southwest, perfect for sailing across to Manhattan. The evacuation accelerates. Boats that were rowing now raise sails and cross in half the time. It's the kind of lucky break that makes men believe in Providence. But dawn is coming fast, and there are still thousands of men on the heights. As the sky begins to lighten, a thick fog rolls in off the harbor. It's the kind of fog that reduces visibility to a few yards. You can't see the British trenches. You can't see the river. You can barely see the man in front of you. The fog is so thick, so perfectly timed, that American soldiers will later swear it was divine intervention, God himself hiding their escape. By 7 a.m, the last boat is loading. Washington is among the last men to leave, making sure every soldier who can walk gets aboard. As his boat pushes off from the Brooklyn shore, British soldiers finally realize what's happened. They rush to the waterfront and fire after the retreating boats, but the fog and the range make their shots useless. The entire Continental Army has escaped. 9,000 men somehow have slipped through a British trap that should have been airtight. Not a single boat was lost to enemy action. The British and Hessian troops occupying Brooklyn Heights an hour later find the American positions empty, except for a few stragglers too sick or too drunk to move. The cannons are spiked and useless. The supplies are mostly gone. The rebels have vanished like smoke. General Howe stands on the heights, looking across at Manhattan, and realizes he's been cheated of the decisive victory he needed. He won the battle. He controls Brooklyn. But the American army, beaten and bloodied, is still alive. The war goes on. The escape from Long Island enters American mythology immediately. In an objective military sense, it was a catastrophic defeat. Washington lost a quarter of his army as casualties or prisoners. He lost his forward positions. He lost control of Long Island, and soon he'll lose New York City entirely. But he saved the army, and in 1776, the army is the Revolution. If Washington had been forced to surrender on Brooklyn Heights, if 9,000 Continental soldiers had stacked their weapons and marched into British prison ships, the rebellion would have collapsed. The state militias would have gone home. Congress would have been forced to negotiate. American independence would have died in August of 1776. Instead, Washington retreated. He lived to fight another day. And that fact, that simple survival, kept the revolution alive. The British controlled New York City for the rest of the war. 7 years of occupation. But they never destroyed Washington's army. They won battles. They captured cities. But they never landed the knockout blow. And every day the Continental Army survived was another day Britain's will to fight eroded. The men who escaped Long Island, especially the survivors of the Maryland Line's suicidal charges, became the core of the professional Continental Army. They were tested in the worst possible conditions and didn't break. They learned that British regulars could be beaten, if not in open battle then, through endurance and refusal to quit. Washington learned lessons that shaped his strategy for the rest of the war. Never again would he risk his entire army defending a fixed position. Never again would he divide his forces in the face of superior numbers. He learned to trade space for time, to retreat when necessary, to strike when the odds favored him, and vanish when they didn't. Long Island taught him that survival was victory. The British, meanwhile, learned all the wrong lessons. Howe believed his decision to use formal siege tactics instead of an immediate assault was vindicated. He'd won the battle with minimal British casualties. The fact that the Americans escaped didn't seem to bother him much. There would be other battles, other opportunities. He had time, except he didn't. The British didn't understand that in a revolutionary war, the clock was working against them. Every month the rebellion survived was another month of British taxpayers funding an expensive war. Every month was another chance for France or Spain to enter the conflict. Every month was another winter of discontent in London. The Americans just had to survive. The British had to win decisively. And after Long Island, they never got another chance quite as good. The irony is brutal. The British won their biggest battle of the entire war. They shattered the Continental Army. They captured New York. And it didn't matter, because Washington slipped away in the fog, and the revolution went on. In the weeks after Long Island, Washington's situation went from bad to worse. The British pursued him up Manhattan, forcing him to fight a series of delaying actions. At Harlem Heights, at White Plains, the Americans showed they could stand and fight for short periods before retreating again. But Washington's army was bleeding strength. Men deserted every night. Enlistments expired, and soldiers went home. Disease ravaged the camps. By November, the Continental Army was a shell of what it had been in August. And then Washington made another catastrophic mistake. He left a garrison of nearly 3,000 men at Fort Washington on the northern tip of Manhattan Island. He believed the fort could hold out. He was wrong. The British attacked Fort Washington on November 16th and took it in a single afternoon. Almost 3,000 Americans surrendered, the largest single loss of the war. Combined with Long Island, Washington had lost over a third of his entire army in 3 months. Congress was furious. Officers were openly questioning his leadership. The newspapers called for his removal. The revolution was drowning. Washington retreated across New Jersey with what was left of his army. Maybe 3,000 men still fit for duty. The British pursued, expecting him to surrender any day. It was the darkest moment of the entire war. And then Washington did something that changed everything. On Christmas night, 1776, he crossed the Delaware River and attacked a Hessian garrison at Trenton. It was a desperate gamble, a last roll of the dice. The Americans caught the Hessians completely by surprise, killed or captured the entire garrison, and escaped before British reinforcements arrived. A week later, Washington struck again at Princeton, routing British regulars and proving the Continental Army could still fight. Trenton and Princeton didn't undo the damage of Long Island. They didn't give Washington back the men he'd lost, or the ground he'd given up. But they proved the revolution wasn't dead. They proved that the army could win. And they bought Washington the one thing he couldn't afford to lose: time. The thread running from Long Island to Trenton is the thread of survival. Washington lost the battle, but saved the army. He lost New York, but preserved the revolution. He learned that in this war, defeat wasn't fatal as long as you escaped to fight again. The British never understood this. They kept winning battles and wondering why the Americans wouldn't quit. They'd been trained to fight European wars, where one decisive battle could end a conflict. But this wasn't a European war. This was something new. A people's war. A war of exhaustion. And the side that quit first would lose. The British Empire, for all its power, had never fought an enemy that refused to acknowledge defeat. They'd crushed rebellions in Scotland, in Ireland, in India. But those rebellions had leaders who could surrender, capitals that could be captured, armies that could be destroyed in a single blow. The American Revolution had no capital that mattered, no single leader whose capture would end the fight, and an army that could be scattered and reformed endlessly as long as men believed in the cause. The soldiers who survived Long Island carried that battle with them for the rest of their lives. The Maryland men who made those suicidal charges became legends. The Maryland Line became one of the most respected units in the Continental Army. When veterans applied for pensions decades later, men who fought at Long Island received special recognition. They'd been tested in the furnace and come through. The battle also revealed the character of the men who would lead America to victory. Washington's decision to retreat instead of surrendering, his personal courage staying on Brooklyn Heights until the last boat left, and his willingness to take responsibility for the disaster all demonstrated the kind of leader he was. He wasn't a brilliant tactician. He made terrible mistakes at Long Island. But he was a man who wouldn't quit, who learned from failure, and who inspired loyalty even in defeat. That mattered more than tactical genius. Lord Stirling's sacrifice at Gowanus showed what American officers were willing to do for their men and their cause. Stirling survived the battle, was exchanged for British prisoners, and went on to serve with distinction for the rest of the war. But he never forgot the Maryland boys who died buying time for the army to escape. Neither did Washington. The common soldiers who stood in those trenches, who retreated in silence through the rain, who climbed into boats in the darkness, and trusted that somehow they'd survive, these men became the backbone of American independence. They weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers and shopkeepers and apprentices who believed that liberty was worth dying for. Long Island tested that belief, and it held. The British would have more chances to destroy Washington's army. At Germantown, at Monmouth, at dozens of smaller engagements throughout the war. Each time, Washington would fight when he thought he could win, and retreat when he couldn't. The strategy wasn't glorious. It frustrated his own officers and drove Congress to distraction. But it worked. By 1778, France entered the war on the American side, having been convinced by Saratoga that the Americans could actually win. French money, French weapons, and eventually, French troops and ships tipped the balance. By 1781, Washington had Cornwallis trapped at Yorktown with French naval support, and the war effectively ended with British surrender. But none of that happens if Washington loses his army at Long Island. None of it happens if he chooses to make a heroic last stand on Brooklyn Heights, instead of a humiliating retreat through the fog. The willingness to lose a battle, to preserve the army, to trade pride for survival, to endure criticism and mockery and keep fighting anyway, that's what won American independence. Long Island was the moment Washington learned that lesson. It cost him 3,000 casualties, and the biggest city in America, but it bought him the future. When you stand back and look at the entire Revolutionary War, Long Island becomes a hinge point. Before Long Island, the Americans believed they could fight the British conventionally, that militia spirit and defensive positions would be enough. After Long Island, they knew better. They learned they had to fight differently, to use the vastness of the continent and the support of the population and the sheer bloody-minded refusal to quit as weapons the British couldn't counter. The Maryland Line's charges at Gowanus became a metaphor for the entire American war effort, attacking against impossible odds, taking devastating casualties, achieving the objective anyway through sheer determination. That's how the war was won. Not through brilliant tactics or superior forces, but through the willingness to keep fighting no matter how many times you got knocked down. The fog that covered the retreat became part of American mythology for good reason. It represented the providential luck that Americans believed guided their cause. But the fog wouldn't have mattered if Washington hadn't organized the retreat, if his officers hadn't maintained discipline, if the men hadn't trusted their leaders enough to march silently to the boats instead of panicking. The miracle was human as much as divine. Today, if you visit Brooklyn, you can walk the ground where the Battle of Long Island was fought. The old stone house, where the Maryland Line died, has been rebuilt as a museum. There are markers at the Jamaica Pass explaining how the British flanked the American position. Brooklyn Heights is now a trendy neighborhood with million-dollar brownstones and spectacular views of Manhattan. It's hard to imagine that this peaceful urban landscape was once a desperate battlefield where the fate of a nation hung in the balance. But the ghosts are still there if you know how to look for them. Every year on August 27th, small ceremonies remember the Maryland men who charged 6 times into British guns to buy time for their brothers to escape. Every year, historians walk the ground and marvel at how close the revolution came to ending in a single afternoon. The legacy of Long Island runs deeper than monuments and ceremonies. It's embedded in American military culture. The idea that retreat isn't defeat if you preserve your force to fight again. The willingness to sacrifice the few to save the many. The understanding that wars aren't won in single battles, but through campaigns and endurance. These concepts all trace back to that foggy night when Washington pulled off the impossible and saved his army. The battle also demonstrated something the British never quite grasped. Americans fight differently. They don't have the formal training or the rigid discipline of European armies, but they have initiative, adaptability, and a fundamental belief in their cause that makes them dangerous even in defeat. The Maryland line didn't charge because they were ordered to. They charged because they understood what was at stake. That kind of motivation can't be drilled into soldiers. It has to be believed. Modern military analysts still study the Long Island campaign as an example of how not to defend an island position and how to execute an amphibious retreat under pressure. The British operation was textbook perfect. The American defense was a disaster, and yet the Americans achieved their strategic objective: survival. It's a reminder that wars are won by achieving objectives, not by following the textbook. Washington's greatest strength wasn't his tactical brilliance. It was his understanding that the objective wasn't to win every battle. It was to keep the army in the field until Britain's will to fight collapsed. Long Island taught him that survival was its own form of victory. The price paid by the men who fought at Long Island echoed through the rest of the war. The prisoners taken by the British, over 1,000 men, were crammed into prison ships anchored in New York Harbor. The HMS Jersey and similar vessels became floating hellholes where men died of disease, starvation, and neglect by the hundreds. More Americans died in British prison ships than were killed in all the battles of the war combined. The men captured at Long Island and Fort Washington made up a large portion of those prisoners. Their sacrifice is often forgotten, but it was real, and it was terrible. The survivors of the battle carried physical and psychological scars for life. In their pension applications years later, veterans described the nightmares, the guilt of abandoning positions, the memory of friends left behind. But they also described pride. They'd been there when everything collapsed, and they'd survived to see the cause triumph. They'd retreated through the fog and lived across the Delaware. They'd seen the worst and come through. That experience forged them into the core of the army that eventually won at Yorktown. You can't understand Washington's leadership without understanding Long Island. His worst defeat taught him how to eventually win. His humiliation in Brooklyn made him the general who could trap Cornwallis in Virginia. The willingness to endure criticism, to retreat when necessary, to absorb losses, and keep fighting these qualities defined Washington's command, and they were all tested in the fires of Long Island. The common soldiers who fought there represent something essential about the American military tradition. They weren't professional warriors. They were citizens who took up arms when needed and went home when the job was done. They made mistakes. They panicked sometimes. They ran when they should have stood. But when it mattered most, when the choice was between surrendering and somehow finding a way to survive, they found the way. The boats that carried them across the East River in the darkness carried more than soldiers. They carried the idea that ordinary people could challenge the greatest empire on earth and win. Not because they were better soldiers, but because they believed in something worth fighting for, and they refused to quit. That's the real legacy of Long Island. Not the tactics, or the strategy, or the specific battles fought, but the demonstration that American forces could lose every battle and still win the war as long as they never lost the will to fight. The British won at Long Island. They won at New York. They won at Philadelphia. They won battle after battle, and they lost the war. Because winning battles doesn't matter if your enemy won't acknowledge defeat. Because controlling cities doesn't matter if you can't control the countryside. Because destroying armies doesn't matter if new armies keep forming. The American Revolution was won by the men who retreated in the fog on August 29, 1776. They understood something the British never did. Sometimes survival is victory. Sometimes living to fight another day is the greatest tactical achievement possible. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is run away and come back stronger. If General Howe had stormed Brooklyn Heights on August 28th, instead of beginning a formal siege, the war likely ends with Washington's surrender. If the fog hadn't rolled in at dawn on the 29th, British ships spot the evacuation and turn the retreat into a massacre. If the wind hadn't shifted at 4 in the morning, hundreds of men are still on the heights when the sun rises. The margin between disaster and survival measured in hours, in fog banks, in wind direction. History turned on such small things, but it also turned on human decisions. Washington's choice to retreat, Sterling's choice to attack, the Maryland men's choice to charge one more time, the boat crew's choice to keep rowing back and forth all night in the cold rain, the soldiers' choice to trust their officers and march silently to the boats instead of panicking. These choices, made by individuals in moments of crisis, added up to something larger than any single person. They added up to a nation that refused to die. That's what makes Long Island so important. Not because it was a great American victory, it wasn't. Not because it demonstrated superior American tactics, it didn't. But because it showed that even in the darkest hour, even when everything collapses, even when defeat seems certain, Americans could find a way to survive and keep fighting. That quality, that stubborn refusal to accept the inevitable, that determination to make one more charge, or row one more trip, or march one more mile, that's what won the revolution. The British never understood it. They kept expecting the Americans to behave rationally, to acknowledge when they were beaten, to accept reality. But the Americans had a different reality. Their reality said that liberty was worth any sacrifice, that independence mattered more than victory in any single battle, and that as long as one man with a musket still believed in the cause, the revolution continued. 23,000 British troops tried to finish the revolution in 1776. They shattered the Continental Army. They captured New York. They drove Washington into retreat. Everything collapsed, just like the title promised. The American defense collapsed. The strategy collapsed. The illusion that militia could stand against regulars collapsed. Everything fell apart in blood and panic and desperate retreat. But the revolution didn't collapse. Because in the fog and the darkness, in the cold rain and the desperate silence, 9,000 Americans found boats and crossed a river and lived to fight another day. And that made all the difference. The Battle of Long Island was a catastrophic defeat that became the foundation of ultimate victory. The retreat through the fog was a humiliation that became an inspiration. The loss of a battle preserved an army. The sacrifice of the few saved the many. The darkest day of the revolution became the moment that proved the revolution couldn't be killed. You can shatter the army. You can capture the cities. You can win every battle. But if you can't kill the idea, if you can't break the will, if you can't stop men from believing that freedom is worth dying for, then you can't win the war. The British learned that lesson the hard way, over 7 years of frustration. The Americans learned it in one terrible day on Long Island. And in the end, it was the Americans who remembered what they learned. That's why the revolution survived. That's why we're here telling this story. Because on August 29th, 1776, in the darkness and the fog, American soldiers chose survival over glory. And in making that choice, they chose victory over defeat. They just didn't know it yet.